My name is Dora Jenkins. I'm 58 years old, and 3 weeks ago I discovered my husband's family had planned his entire funeral without me. Not a phone call, not a text, not even a courtesy. Heads up, I found out when the funeral director called to confirm the casket selection I'd never made and the service time I'd never agreed to. The woman on the phone was professional but confused when I told her I was Robert's wife and had no idea what she was talking about. There was a long pause before she said, "Mrs. Jenkins, your sister-in-law Patricia called yesterday with all the arrangements. She said she was handling everything because you were too grief-stricken to make decisions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." I wasn't too grief-stricken. I was at the hospital every single day for the past 6 months, holding Robert's hand through chemo, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs, coordinating with doctors, managing his medications, and making sure he had everything he needed. Patricia showed up twice in 6 months, both times with her expensive purse and fake sympathy, asking if there was anything in Robert's will she should know about. I should have seen it coming. But grief makes you blind to things you'd normally catch. The funeral director seemed to realize something was wrong. She asked if I'd like to come in to discuss the arrangements, and I told her yes. Absolutely, because I was Robert's wife of 32 years, and the person legally responsible for his final wishes. When I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at Robert's empty coffee mug still sitting on the counter from the morning before he passed. That's when the anger hit me. Not the sad kind that makes you cry, but the cold kind that makes you think. The funeral home was a modest place on Maple Street, the kind with soft lighting and tissues strategically placed on every surface. Mrs. Coleman, the funeral director, greeted me with the careful sympathy they probably teach in mortuary school. She led me to a small office where file folders were spread across her desk, each one labeled with Robert's name in neat handwriting. "I have to admit, Mrs. Jenkins, I'm a bit confused about the situation," she began, adjusting her glasses. "Your sister-in-law was quite insistent that she had authority to make these decisions. She even brought what she claimed was a power of attorney document." My blood went cold. What kind of power of attorney? Mrs. Coleman shuffled through her papers and pulled out a photocopy. This one, dated 6 months ago. "It grants Patricia Jenkins financial and medical decision-making authority in the event of your husband's incapacitation." I stared at the document. Robert's signature was there. Shaky but recognizable. It was dated 3 days after his cancer diagnosis, when he was still in shock and Patricia had made one of her rare visits to the hospital. I remembered that day clearly, because she'd insisted on speaking to Robert alone, said it was about family business, and asked me to get coffee. I'd thought she was finally showing some genuine concern for her brother. "This doesn't give her authority over funeral arrangements," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "And my husband passed away, so this document is no longer valid anyway. I'm his spouse and legal next of kin." Miss Coleman nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right. I should have verified this more carefully. I apologize for the confusion. Would you like to review the arrangements she made?" She opened another folder. Patricia had chosen the most expensive casket in the showroom, upgraded the service to include a full choir, ordered premium flowers, and scheduled the funeral for Thursday at 2 in the afternoon. She'd even arranged for a reception at the country club afterward, the same country club where she and her husband were members and I'd never set foot inside. "What's the total cost?" I asked. "With all the upgrades, it comes to 8. Robert and I had discussed funeral arrangements during one of his lucid moments between treatments. He wanted something simple, cremation, a small service with close friends, nothing fancy or expensive. We'd even looked at costs together and budgeted for something around $5,000. "Did she put down a deposit?" She said the family would handle payment after the service. She mentioned something about life insurance proceeds covering everything. Life insurance proceeds. My life insurance proceeds. The policy Robert had maintained through his job for the past 15 years. with me as the sole beneficiary. Patricia knew about it because Robert had mentioned it once at a family dinner, back when we still attended those painful gatherings, where his siblings treated me like an outsider who'd somehow tricked their brother into marriage. I need to make some changes to these arrangements, I told Miss Coleman. Significant changes. She nodded and pulled out a fresh form. We spent the next hour going through everything. I canceled the expensive casket and selected a simple pine box. I eliminated the choir, reduced the flowers to a single spray, and moved the service to the smaller chapel. The country club reception was completely canceled. When we finished, the total cost was $4,800, almost exactly what Robert and I had planned. Mrs. Coleman seemed relieved to be working with someone who actually knew what the deceased would have wanted. "I'll call Patricia to let her know about the changes," she offered. "No," I said quickly. "Let me handle that. And Mrs. Coleman, if anyone from Robert's family calls you directly, please refer them to me. I'm the legal decision-maker here, and I want to make sure there are no more misunderstandings." Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about that power of attorney document. Patricia had manipulated Robert when he was at his most vulnerable, probably convinced him it was just a precaution, something to help me if I got overwhelmed. Instead, she'd used it to try to control his death the same way his family had tried to control our entire marriage. Robert's family had never accepted me. When we got engaged, his mother actually asked him if he was sure he wouldn't rather wait and find someone more suitable. At our wedding, his sister Patricia made a toast that included the phrase, "We hope this works out for the best," as if I were some kind of experiment. For 32 years, I'd endured their passive-aggressive comments, their exclusion from family decisions, their assumption that I was somehow temporary. But Robert had always defended me. He'd chosen me over them repeatedly, which only made them resent me more. When he got sick, I thought maybe they'd finally see how much I loved him, how I was the one who never left his side. Instead, they saw opportunity. That evening, I was going through Robert's desk, looking for insurance papers, when I found something that made my hands shake. It was a folder labeled Family Trust that I'd never seen before. Inside were documents establishing a trust fund that Robert had apparently set up 18 months ago, right around the time he'd started feeling tired all the time, before we knew it was cancer. The trust was substantial, funded with money from his 401k and some investments I hadn't known about. Robert had always handled our finances, and I'd trusted him completely. According to the documents, the trust was designed to provide for me after his death, ensuring I'd have monthly income and wouldn't have to worry about money during my grief. But there was a problem. The trust had been modified 6 months ago, the same time period as that power of attorney. Patricia wasn't just listed as a trustee, she was listed as the primary trustee, with authority to make all distributions. I was listed as a beneficiary, but Patricia controlled whether and how much I'd receive. I read through the trust documents 3 times, each reading making me angry. There were clauses about appropriate mourning periods and family consultation before major distributions. Patricia had essentially given herself veto power over my financial future, all while Robert was sick and probably not thinking clearly about the implications. The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. It was Patricia. "Dora, I heard you went to the funeral home today and made some changes. I have to say, I'm disappointed. Robert deserves a proper send-off, not some bargain basement serve." Her voice had that condescending tone I'd heard for 3 decades, like she was explaining something to a child. "Patricia, Robert and I discussed his funeral wishes extensively. He wanted something simple and dignified, not an expensive production." Well, I think I knew my brother a little better than that. The family has certain standards. Dora, people will be watching, and we can't have them thinking we didn't honor Robert properly. "The family," I repeated. "I'm his family. I'm his wife. You know what I mean, his blood family. We've already sent invitations to the country club reception. People are expecting it. Then you can call them and explain that the plans have changed." There was a pause, and when Patricia spoke again, her voice was colder. "Dora, I don't think you're thinking clearly right now. Grief can affect judgment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Maybe you should let the people who aren't so emotionally involved handle these decisions, the way you handled getting power of attorney from my sick husband. Another pause, longer this time. Robert asked me to. He was worried about you, about whether you could handle things if something happened to him. That's what family does, Dora. We take care of each other. Family takes care of each other, I repeated slowly. Is that why you set up a trust that gives you control over my financial future? The silence stretched so long I thought she might have hung up. Finally she said, I don't know what you're talking about. The family trust, Patricia. The one where you're the primary trustee, the one that gives you authority over money that's supposed to support me. That trust is designed to protect you, Dora, to make sure you don't make any rash financial decisions while you're grieving. Robert was concerned about your judgment. My judge, the woman who'd managed our household finances for 32 years, who'd researched every treatment option for Robert's cancer, who'd negotiated with insurance companies and coordinated with specialists, apparently couldn't be trusted with money. Here's what's going to happen, Patricia. The funeral arrangements stay as I've made them. If you want to host your own memorial service at the country club, that's your business, but you'll pay for it yourself, and I'm going to look into this trust situation very carefully. I hung up before she could respond. My hands were shaking, but not from grief this time. For the first time since Robert's diagnosis, I felt something other than sadness. I felt angry, and anger was something I could work with. The next morning, I called David Morrison, the lawyer who'd helped us with our wills years ago. He agreed to see me that afternoon, and I brought every document I'd found in Robert's desk. David was a man in his 60s with kind eyes and a reputation for straight talk. Dora, I'm so sorry for your loss, he said, as I settled into the chair across from his desk. Robert was a good man. Now what can I help you with? I laid out the whole situation, the power of attorney, the funeral arrangements, the trust fund. David listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. I have to tell you, I didn't prepare any of these documents. If I had, I would have insisted that you be present for the signings, especially for the trust modifications. This power of attorney is legitimate, but as you correctly noted, it terminated when Robert passed away. The trust, however, is more complicated. He pulled out a magnifying glass and examined Robert's signatures more closely. These signatures look authentic, but the circumstances under which they were obtained might be questionable. Tell me, was Robert on any medications that might have affected his judgment when these were signed? He was on pain medication and anti-anxiety drugs. The doctors said they could cause confusion and mood changes. He had good days and bad days. David nodded grimly. That's what I was afraid of. Patricia may have legal authority under these documents, but the circumstances of their creation might give us grounds to challenge them. However, challenging a trust can be expensive and time-consuming, and there's no guarantee of success. What are my other options? Well, as Robert's spouse, you have certain rights regardless of what the trust says. You're entitled to a portion of his estate under Ohio's elective share statute. But more importantly, if Patricia breaches her fiduciary duty as trustee, she can be held personally liable. What constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty? David smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. Using trust assets for her own benefit, making distributions that aren't in your best interest, or failing to act prudently in managing the trust. Trustees have very strict legal obligations. Dora, if Patricia steps out of line, we can make her life very difficult. I left David's office with a clearer understanding of my situation, and a plan beginning to form in my mind. Patricia thought she held all the cards, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated me. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened a bottle of wine, the good stuff that Robert and I had been saving for a special occasion that never came. I sat at our kitchen table with all the documents spread out in front of me, and I began to really study them. The trust was worth more than I'd initially realized. Robert had been secretly building it for years, probably intending it as a surprise security blanket for my future. The monthly distributions Patricia controlled could amount to over $3,000, enough to make the difference between struggling and living comfortably, but there were other assets too, things the trust didn't control. Our house was in both our names, so I owned it outright now. Robert's life insurance policy still listed me as the sole beneficiary, and Patricia had no authority over that. His pension from the city had a survivor benefit that would come directly to me. Patricia had grabbed control of the trust, but she didn't control everything, and more importantly, she didn't know what I knew about her own financial situation. You see, Robert had talked to me about his family's finances over the years, usually when he was frustrated by their constant requests for loans. Patricia and her husband Marcus lived well beyond their means, maintaining an expensive lifestyle on his modest insurance agent salary. They'd borrowed money from Robert multiple times over the years, always with promises to pay it back, promises that were rarely kept. Robert had kept records of these loans, mostly out of habit rather than any real expectation of repayment. The folder was in his desk, labeled Family Loans, and it made for interesting reading. Over the past 10 years, Patricia and Marcus had borrowed nearly $40,000 from Robert. Sometimes it was for emergencies like car repairs or medical bills. Sometimes it was for luxuries like vacations or home improvements they couldn't afford. The loans were documented with IOUs and promissory notes, all signed by both Patricia and Mark. Robert had been too generous to ever demand repayment, but I wasn't Robert, and as his heir, those debts were now owed to me. I poured another glass of wine and started making calculations. $40,000 in principal, plus reasonable interest over the years, would amount to a significant sum, more than enough to cause serious problems for someone living paycheck to paycheck and trying to maintain an upper-middle-class facade. But the loans were just the beginning. I'd learned a few things about financial investigation during Robert's illness, when I'd had to track down insurance claims and coordinate benefits. I knew how to research public records, how to check court filings, how to verify someone's financial claim. Patricia thought she was clever, using Robert's illness to position herself as the responsible family member who needed to protect me from my own poor judgment. But she'd made the mistake of underestimating the grieving widow. She didn't realize that grief can make you sharp as well as sad, especially when you discover that people you trusted have been planning to take advantage of you. I spent the next several hours on my laptop, researching Patricia and Marcus's financial situation. Public records are amazing things when you know where to look. Property records, court filings, business licenses, bankruptcy records. It's all there for anyone who cares to dig deep enough. What I found was enlightening. Patricia and Marcus had filed for bankruptcy 7 years ago, discharged most of their debts, and immediately started living beyond their means again. They'd taken out a second mortgage on their house 2 years ago, probably to pay for that European vacation. Patricia had posted all over Facebook. Marcus's insurance agency was struggling, based on the business license renewals and the fact that they'd downsized their office space. Most interestingly, they'd recently applied for a home equity loan and been denied. The rejection letter was part of the public record, and it cited insufficient income and too much existing debt as the reasons for denial. So Patricia was cash poor and desperate, which explained why she was so interested in controlling Robert's trust. She probably saw it as her family's financial salvation, a way to solve their money problems while appearing to help me. The monthly income from managing the trust, plus whatever she could skim from the distributions, would make a huge difference in their lifestyle. But Patricia had overlooked something crucial. I wasn't the helpless, grief-stricken widow she thought I was. I was a woman who'd just discovered that people she'd tolerated for 32 years had betrayed her trust and stolen her security, and I was about to show her exactly what that was going to cost them. I opened a new document on my laptop and began drafting a letter, not to Patricia but to Marcus's employer, the regional insurance company that franchised his agency. In my research, I'd discovered that insurance agents have very strict ethical requirements, particularly when it comes to financial conduct. Agents who file for bankruptcy or have financial judgment issues can lose their licenses. I didn't write anything untrue. I simply outlined the facts. Marcus had borrowed money from a family member and failed to repay it, had filed for bankruptcy, and immediately resumed irresponsible spending, and was currently in financial distress while being responsible for managing other people's insurance policies and claims. I didn't send the letter that night. Instead, I saved it to my drafts folder and went to bed, but for the first time since Robert's diagnosis, I fell asleep quickly and slept soundly. I had a plan, and plans made me feel less helpless. The funeral was exactly what Robert would have wanted: simple, dignified, and focused on celebrating his life rather than impressing anyone. About 50 people attended, mostly our friends and a few of his co-workers. Patricia and Marcus sat in the front row. Patricia dressed in an expensive black suit that probably cost more than my entire funeral budget. After the service, several people approached me to offer condolences and share memories of Robert. Patricia interrupted one of these conversations to pull me aside. "The turnout was smaller than I expected," she said, her voice carrying that familiar criticism. "If we'd had the service at the country club like I planned, more people would have come." "The people who mattered were here," I replied. "Robert would have been happy with this." "Well, I hope you're satisfied." This certainly looked budget conscious. I stared at her for a long moment. She was actually criticizing me for not spending enough money on my husband's funeral, money that would have come from life insurance proceeds that belonged to me. "Patricia, we need to talk about the trust situation soon. I've been reviewing the documents." Her expression tightened slightly. "There's nothing to discuss, Dora. Everything is properly set up to provide for your needs. You don't need to worry about the financial details." "Actually, I do need to worry about them. It's my future we're talking about. Robert specifically wanted family oversight of your finances during this difficult time. He was concerned about your ability to make sound decisions while grieving." The condescension in her voice was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. This was the same woman who'd filed for bankruptcy, borrowed $40,000 from my husband and never paid it back, and been denied a home equity loan for poor financial management. And she was questioning my judgment. "I see," I said calmly. "Well, I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to discuss it. By the way, Patricia, I've been going through Robert's papers and I found some interesting documents. IOUs, promissory notes, that sort of thing. We should probably talk about those too." The color drained from her face. "What kind of IOU?" "The kind that show you and Marcus borrowed nearly $40,000 from Robert over the years, with interest of course." Patricia glanced around nervously, probably worried that someone might overhear. "Dora, those were family loans, informal arrangements between siblings. Robert never expected us to actually pay them back. Maybe Robert didn't, but I'm not Robert, and as his heir, those debts are now owed to me." She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "You can't be serious." "I'm very serious, Patricia. I'm a widow with limited income, thanks to the trust arrangement you set up. I need every asset available to me, including outstanding debts owed to my husband's estate. But we don't have that kind of money. Then we have a problem, don't we?" I walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing there with her mouth open. For 32 years I'd been the quiet daughter-in-law who never made waves, never caused problems, never stood up for herself. That woman had died with Robert. The woman walking away from Patricia was someone entirely new, someone who'd finally learned that being nice to people who mistreat you isn't kindness, it's enabling. As I drove home from the funeral, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Patricia thought she'd outmaneuvered me, set herself up as the gatekeeper to my financial future, while positioning herself to benefit from my grief. She thought I was too sad, too overwhelmed, too helpless to fight back. She was about to discover how wrong she was. The morning after Robert's funeral, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The fog of grief was still there, but underneath it was something sharper, more focused. I made coffee in Robert's favorite mug and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and a yellow legal pad. If Patricia wanted to play games with my financial future, she was about to learn that I could play games too. I started with what I knew. Patricia had positioned herself as the responsible family member, looking out for poor, confused Dora. She'd convinced Robert to sign documents giving her control over his trust fund while he was sick and medicated. She'd tried to plan an expensive funeral and stick me with the bill, and she owed my late husband $40,000 that she'd conveniently forgotten about. But I needed to know more. I needed to understand exactly how vulnerable Patricia and Marcus really were, because leverage only works when you know where to apply pressure. I spent the morning researching public records online. It's amazing what you can learn about someone's finances if you know where to look. Property records showed that Patricia and Marcus had bought their house for $280,000, 12 years ago. They'd refinanced it 3 times, each time pulling out more equity to fund their lifestyle. The current mortgage balance was $310,000, on a house that was probably worth $260,000 in today's market. They were underwater on their mortgage, which explained why they'd been denied that home equity loan. Court records revealed even more interesting details. Marcus had been sued twice by creditors in the past 5 years. Both cases had been settled out of court, but the fact that they'd gotten to the lawsuit stage told me his creditors had been desperate to collect. You don't sue someone unless you've exhausted other options. I found their bankruptcy filing from 7 years ago and read through it carefully. The list of discharged debts was extensive: credit cards, personal loans, medical bills, even money owed to Marcus's former business partner. They'd been given a fresh start and immediately started making the same mistakes again. Most telling was Marcus's business license renewal history. His insurance agency had been downgraded from a full office to a home-based business 2 years ago. The State Insurance Commission website showed that his agency's client base had shrunk significantly, probably because people don't trust their insurance to agents who can't manage their own finances. But the real goldmine was Patricia's social media presence. She documented their lifestyle obsessively on Facebook and Instagram, posting photos of expensive restaurants, designer handbags, weekend trips to Chicago, and Marcus's new boat. The boat was particularly interesting because boat loans are public record, and I discovered they were paying $800 a month for a 25-foot fishing boat they used maybe 6 times a year. I cross-referenced Patricia's posts with their income sources, and the timeline was revealing. Every time they'd borrowed money from Robert, Patricia's social media showed a sudden increase in expensive activity. The $5,000 they'd borrowed for car repairs coincided with a weekend trip to Las Vegas. The $8,000 for medical bills appeared to have funded Patricia's kitchen renovation. By noon, I had a complete picture of their financial situation, and it was worse than I'd imagined. They were living paycheck to paycheck while maintaining an expensive facade, drowning in debt they couldn't service, and completely dependent on external sources of income to avoid financial collapse. That external income had been Robert. For years they'd used him as their personal bank, borrowing money whenever their poor financial decisions caught up with them. Now that Robert was gone, they needed a new source of funding, and they'd positioned themselves to drain his trust fund while claiming to protect me. I picked up my phone and called David Morrison. "David, it's Dora Jenkins. I've been doing some research on Patricia and Marcus's financial situation, and I think we need to discuss strategy." "What kind of strategy?" "The kind that makes Patricia very eager to cooperate with me instead of trying to control me." David chuckled. "I'm listening." I outlined what I'd discovered about their finances, their debts, and their history of borrowing from Rob. David listened carefully, occasionally asking questions about documentation and timing. "Dora, this is excellent work. You've essentially documented a pattern of financial irresponsibility that directly contradicts Patricia's claim that she's qualified to manage a trust fund. But more importantly, you've identified multiple pressure points we can use to negotiate." "What kind of pressure points?" "Well, first, there's the outstanding debt to Robert's estate. $40,000 plus interest is significant, especially for people who are already financially stretched. Second, there's Marcus's insurance license. The State Insurance Commission takes a very dim view of agents with ongoing financial problems. A formal complaint about his debt management could trigger a license review. What would that mean for them? If Marcus loses his insurance license, he loses his livelihood. Even the threat of a license review would probably be enough to get their attention. I felt a surge of satisfaction. "What's our next step?" "Let me draft a formal demand letter for the outstanding loans. We'll send it certified mail so there's no question they received it. Then we'll schedule a meeting to discuss both the debt situation and the trust arrangement. My guess is that once Patricia realizes you're not the helpless widow she thought you were, she'll be much more reasonable about the trust distributions. And if she's not reasonable, then we escalate, file complaints with the insurance commission, pursue legal action for the debt recovery, and challenge the trust documents based on the circumstances under which they were signed. Trust me, Dora, Patricia doesn't want any of those things to happen. After hanging up with David, I felt energized in a way I hadn't since Robert's diagnosis. For months I'd felt powerless, watching my husband deteriorate while his family positioned themselves to benefit from his death. Now I was taking action, fighting back, refusing to be the victim they expected me to be. But I wasn't done researching. If I was going to war with Patricia, I needed to understand all the battlefield conditions. I spent the afternoon digging deeper into Marcus's business affairs, and what I found was even more interesting than his personal finances. Marcus's insurance agency was a franchise operation, which meant he had contractual obligations to maintain certain standards of professional conduct. I found the franchise agreement in the public business filings, and it included specific clauses about financial responsibility and ethical behavior. More importantly, Marcus's agency handled claims processing for several major insurance companies. I found complaints filed against his agency with the Better Business Bureau, mostly from clients who felt their claims had been mishandled or delayed. The complaints weren't numerous enough to shut him down, but they painted a picture of declining service quality. Insurance companies are extremely sensitive about their claims processing partners because bad handling can expose them to lawsuits and regulatory problems. If Marcus's financial distress was affecting his ability to serve clients properly, his franchise and his processing contracts could be at risk. I made a list of Marcus's major business relationships, his franchise parent company, the insurance carriers he represented, and the companies that outsourced claims processing to his agency. Each relationship represented a potential pressure point if Marcus's financial problems became public knowledge, but I also knew I had to be careful. Using someone's financial problems to destroy their livelihood crossed a line from self-defense into cruelty. I didn't want to ruin Marcus and Patricia's lives. I just wanted them to stop trying to ruin mine. The key was proportional response. If Patricia cooperated and treated me fairly regarding the trust, I'd be willing to work out reasonable payment terms for the money they owed Robert. But if she insisted on playing hardball, if she tried to use her trusteeship to control and manipulate me, then I'd use every weapon at my disposal to protect myself. That evening I received a call from Patricia. Her voice was different from the condescending tone she'd used at the funeral, more cautious and uncertain. "Dora, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. I want you to know that the trust arrangements are really designed to help you, not control you." "I appreciate that, Patricia. I've been thinking about it too, and I've been reviewing all of Robert's financial documents. It's been quite educational." "What do you mean?" "Well, for instance, I found all the loan documents, the $40,000 you and Marcus borrowed over the years. I had no idea Robert had been so generous with family loans." There was a long pause. "Dora, those weren't really loans in the formal sense. They were just family helping family. Robert never expected us to pay that money back. Actually, Patricia, they were loans in the very formal sense. Robert kept detailed records including signed promissory notes with interest rates. Some of them even have specific payment schedules that you agreed to, but never followed. But Robert never enforced those payment schedules. Robert was generous and kind, sometimes to a fault, but I'm not Robert, and I'm in a very different financial situation than he was. As his widow, I need every asset available to me, including outstanding debts owed to his estate." Another pause, longer this time. "Dora, we don't have $40,000. You know we don't have that kind of money. Then we have a problem, don't we? But I'm sure we can work something out. Maybe we could arrange a payment plan, something reasonable that you could manage." "What kind of payment plan?" "Well, that would depend on several factors. Your income, your expenses, your other obligations, and of course how cooperative you are regarding the trust management." I let that hang in the air for a moment, making sure she understood the connection between the two issues. "What do you mean about trust management?" "Patricia, You've positioned yourself as the person responsible for my financial welfare, but you've done it without my input or consent. You convinced my sick husband to sign documents, giving you control over money that's supposed to support me. That's not protection, that's manipulation. That's not how it was, Dora. Robert was genuinely concerned about your ability to handle financial decisions while grieving. He asked me to help. Did he ask you to plan his funeral without consulting me? Did he ask you to try to stick me with an $18,000 bill for services I didn't want? The funeral arrangements were meant to honor Robert properly. The funeral arrangements were meant to impress your country club friends at my expense. But here's what's going to happen, Patricia. You're going to start treating me like an equal partner in trust decisions, not like a child who needs supervision. And we're going to work out a fair payment plan for the money you owe Robert's estate. And if we can't reach an agreement, then I'll pursue every legal option available to me. I'll file formal collection actions for the debt, with interest and penalty. I'll file complaints with the State Insurance Commission about Marcus's financial management. I'll challenge the trust documents based on the circumstances under which they were obtained. Trust me, Patricia, you don't want any of those things to happen. The line was quiet for nearly a minute. When Patricia spoke again, her voice was much smaller than usual. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that we meet tomorrow with David Morrison, my attorney, to discuss restructuring the trust arrangements and establishing a payment plan for the outstanding debt. I want transparency in the trust management, equal input on major decisions, and a clear understanding of how and when distributions will be made, and the debt. We'll work out something reasonable, maybe $500 a month for the next several years, something you can manage without destroying your lifestyle. $500 a month is a lot of money for us right now, Patricia. You spend more than that on restaurants and entertainment every month. I've seen your social media posts. You bought Marcus a boat last year that costs $800 a month in payments. Don't tell me you can't afford $500 a month to pay back money you borrowed from my dying husband. Another long pause. I need to talk to Marcus, of course. But Patricia, understand this. I'm not the grieving widow you thought you could manipulate. I'm a woman who's finally learned to stand up for herself. You can work with me, or you can work against me, but either way, I'm not backing down. I hung up feeling stronger than I had in months. For the first time since Robert's diagnosis, I felt like I had some control over my situation. Patricia had expected me to be passive and grateful for whatever scraps she decided to throw my way. Instead, she was discovering that stealing from a grieving widow was much more complicated than she'd anticipated. The next morning, David called to tell me he'd drafted the formal demand letter for the outstanding loans. It's comprehensive but not inflammatory, he explained. It lays out the facts, documents the debt, and requests payment within 30 days. It also mentions that failure to respond could result in formal collection actions. What kind of timeline are we looking at if they don't cooperate? If they ignore the demand letter, we can file a lawsuit within 60 days. Given the documentation Robert kept, it would be a straightforward collections case. The real question is whether we want to go that route or use the threat of legal action to negotiate better terms on the trust. I'd rather negotiate if possible. I don't want to destroy them. I just want them to treat me fairly. That's probably the smart approach. Litigation is expensive and time-consuming, even when you're likely to win, but having the threat available gives us significant leverage. That afternoon, I received a text from Patricia asking if we could meet at David's office the next day. Marcus would be coming with her, and they wanted to discuss both the trust situation and the debt issue. I felt a surge of satisfaction. 24 hours ago, Patricia had been treating me like a helpless victim who needed her protection. Now she was asking for meetings and bringing her husband for backup. The balance of power had shifted, and she knew. I spent the evening preparing for the meeting, reviewing all the documents, and making notes about what I wanted to accomplish. My goals were clear: restructure the trust to give me meaningful input on decisions, establish a reasonable payment plan for the debt, and make sure Patricia understood that I wasn't someone she could manipulate or control. But I also thought about Robert and what he would have wanted. He'd loved his family despite their flaws, and he wouldn't have wanted me to destroy them out of spite. At the same time, he'd loved me too, and he'd worked hard to provide for my future. He wouldn't have wanted his family to steal that security from me. The meeting was scheduled for 2 o'clock the next day. As I got ready that morning, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror and saw someone I barely recognized. The exhausted, overwhelmed woman who'd spent months in hospital waiting rooms was gone. In her place was someone harder, more focused, more determined. Patricia had made the mistake of underestimating me, assuming that grief would make me weak and compliant. Instead, she'd awakened something in me that had been dormant for too long, the ability to fight for myself. She was about to learn exactly what that looked like. I arrived at David's office 15 minutes early, wanting to review our strategy one last time. David was confident but cautious. "Remember, Dora, the goal is to reach a reasonable agreement, not to punish them. If they're willing to be fair about the trust and establish a payment plan for the debt, we should take it. The nuclear options are there if we need them, but litigation is always unpredictable. I understand. I just want to make sure they understand that I'm not someone they can push around anymore." I think they're starting to figure that out. At exactly 2 o'clock, Patricia and Marcus arrived. They both looked uncomfortable, Marcus especially. He was a short, thin man who'd always reminded me of a nervous accountant, and today, he seemed particularly fidgety. Patricia was dressed more conservatively than usual, without her typical expensive jewelry and designer handbag. She was trying to look financially responsible, probably hoping to convince us that they weren't as well off as their lifestyle suggested. David started the meeting by outlining the two main issues, the trust management and the outstanding debt. He was professional but firm, making it clear that both issues needed to be resolved. "Let's start with the debt situation," David said, placing a stack of promissory notes on the table. "According to our records, you've borrowed $39,800 from Robert Jenkins over the past 10 years. With accumulated interest, the current balance is approximately $47,000. Marcus looked like he might be sick. "That seems high. Robert never charged us interest before." "Robert never formally demanded repayment before," David replied. "The promissory notes clearly specify interest rates, and under Ohio law, creditors are entitled to collect accumulated interest on unpaid debts." Patricia leaned forward. "David, those loans were family arrangements, informal agreements between siblings. Robert never intended for them to be treated as commercial debt. The documentation suggests otherwise," David said, flipping through the promissory note. "These are signed agreements with specific terms, payment schedules, and interest rates. They're legally binding contracts, regardless of Robert's enforcement decisions." I watched Patricia and Marcus exchange glances. They'd clearly hoped to dismiss the debt as informal family borrowing, but the documentation was too comprehensive to ignore. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus asked quietly. David looked at me, and I nodded. "We're willing to work out a reasonable payment plan," I said. "Something you can manage without destroying your lifestyle, but something that acknowledges the legitimate debt." "What did you have in mind?" Patricia asked. $600 a month for 7 years. That covers the principal plus reasonable interest, and it gives you a manageable payment schedule." Marcus did quick math in his head, and winced. "That's over $50,000 total. That's $47,000 in current debt, plus modest interest over the payment period," David clarified. "It's actually quite reasonable, considering you could be liable for legal fees and penalties if we pursue formal collection." Patricia looked desperate. "We can't afford $600 a month. Our budget is already stretched." "Patricia, you spend more than that on entertainment and discretionary purchases every month," I said calmly. "I've seen your social media posts, the dinners, the shopping, the weekend trip. You can afford $600 a month if you prioritize paying your debts, but that would mean cutting back on everything." "Welcome to reality," I said. "Most people have to make choices between luxuries and obligations. It's time for you to learn that lesson." Marcus looked defeated, but Patricia wasn't giving up. "What about the trust? If we agree to a payment plan, how does that affect the trust management?" David smiled. "I'm glad you asked. The trust arrangement also needs to be restructured to ensure proper oversight and transparency." He pulled out another set of documents. "Currently, Patricia has sole discretion over trust distributions, which is highly unusual for a trust designed to support a surviving spouse. We're proposing several modifications. What kind of modifications? Patricia asked warily. First, Dora will have equal input on all distribution decisions above routine monthly payments. Second, the trust will provide quarterly financial reports to all parties. Third, any decision to withhold or reduce distributions must be justified in writing with specific reasoning. That would eliminate most of my authority as trustee, Patricia protested. It would eliminate your ability to make arbitrary decisions about Dora's financial welfare, David corrected. You'd still handle the administrative functions, but you wouldn't have unilateral control over her income. I leaned forward. Patricia, the trust was supposed to provide for me, not give you power over me. If you're not comfortable with transparent, collaborative management, then maybe you shouldn't be the trustee at all. What do you I mean, we could petition the court to remove you as trustee and appoint someone else. Given the circumstances under which the trust was established, and your current financial conflicts of interest, a judge might be very receptive to that request. Patricia's face went pale. Being removed as trustee would eliminate any benefit she might gain from managing the trust, and it would be a public acknowledgement that she'd abused her position. Marcus finally spoke up. What happens if we don't agree to these terms? David's expression hardened. Then we pursue all available legal remedies. Formal debt collection with penalties and legal fees. A court challenge to the trust documents based on undue influence. Complaints to the State Insurance Commission about Marcus's financial management. Essentially, we make your lives very difficult until you decide to be reasonable. The room was quiet for several minutes. Patricia and Marcus whispered to each other while David and I waited. Finally, Patricia looked up. We need some time to think about this. Of course, David said, but understand that this offer won't remain open indefinitely. If you don't respond within 2 weeks, we'll assume you've chosen the litigation route and act accordingly. As they gathered their things to leave, Patricia turned to me. Dora, I want you to know that we never intended to hurt you. The trust arrangements really were meant to help. Patricia, if you'd wanted to help me, you would have included me in the decisions about my own financial future. Instead, you manipulated my sick husband into giving you control over my security. That's not help. That's exploitation. They left without another word, and David and I sat in his office reviewing what had just happened. How do you think they'll respond? I asked. They'll take the deal, David said confidently. They can't afford not to. The alternative is financial destruction, and they know it, and if they don't, then we follow through on our threats. But honestly, Dora, I think you've already won. They came in here expecting to negotiate from a position of strength, and they're leaving knowing that you hold all the cards. Driving home, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. Standing up to Patricia and Marcus had been necessary, but it wasn't pleasant. I'd never enjoyed conflict, never wanted to be the kind of person who used leverage to force compliance. But I'd also never been in a position where people I'd trusted for decades had betrayed that trust so completely. Patricia had literally tried to steal my financial future while pretending to protect me. She'd manipulated my dying husband and planned to drain his legacy while keeping me dependent on her generosity. If standing up to that made me hard or calculating, then so be it. I'd rather be hard than helpless, calculating than cheated. That evening, I called Michelle, Robert's youngest sister and the only member of his family who'd ever treated me with genuine kindness. Dora, how are you holding up? I've been worried about you since the funeral. I'm doing better than expected actually, but I need to tell you something about Patricia and the family trust situation. I explained everything. The power of attorney manipulation. The trust arrangements, the debt situation, and the meeting we'd just had. Michelle listened without interrupting, occasionally making sounds of disbelief or anger. That is absolutely unbelievable, she said when I finished. Patricia always thought she was smarter than everyone else, but this is beyond belief. She actually tried to steal your financial security while pretending to protect you. That's exactly what she did, and she thought I was too grief-stricken to figure it out or fight back. Good for you for standing up to her. Robert would be proud of you. Sometimes I wonder if he'd want me to just forgive and forget. Keep the family peace. Dora, Robert loved you more than anything in the world. He spent 32 years choosing you over his family whenever they tried to treat you badly. He wouldn't want you to let them steal from you just to avoid conflict. That night, I slept better than I had since Robert's diagnosis. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my future. Some power to protect myself from people who would take advantage of my grief. Patricia had thought grief would make me weak. Instead, it had made me dangerous. She was about to learn exactly how dangerous a woman with nothing left to lose could be. The 2 weeks David had given Patricia and Marcus to respond felt like the longest fortnight of my life. Every morning I checked my email and mailbox, wondering if they'd accept our terms or force us into litigation. But as the deadline approached with no word from them, I began preparing for the possibility that they'd chosen the hard way. On the 13th day, Patricia finally called. Her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. But underneath I could hear something else. Defeat. Dora, we've discussed your proposal with our own attorney. We're prepared to accept the payment plan for the debt. But we have concerns about the trust modifications. What kind of concern? Our lawyer says that changing the trust terms might require court approval. And that could be expensive and time-consuming for everyone involved. I smiled, even though she couldn't see it. Patricia was fishing, hoping I'd back down to avoid legal complications. She didn't realize I'd already discussed this possibility with David. Patricia, the trust modifications can be implemented through a simple amendment document as long as all parties agree. If you refuse to agree, then yes, we'll need court intervention. But that will be much more expensive for you than for me. What do you mean? I mean that if we go to court, we'll be asking for much more than trust modification. We'll challenge the entire trust on grounds of undue influence, seek your removal as trustee, and request full restitution of any distributions you may have already taken for yourself. There was a long pause. We haven't taken any distributions. Haven't? How exactly have you been compensating yourself for your trustee services? Because the trust documents I reviewed don't specify any trustee fees, which means you've either been working for free or taking unauthorized compensation. Another pause, longer this time. Patricia was realizing that every conversation with me revealed another potential legal problem for her. The trust hasn't made any distributions yet, she said carefully. I've just been managing the paperwork and investments. Good. Then there shouldn't be any problem with implementing more transparent oversight going forward. Fine. We'll accept your terms for both the debt payments and the trust modifications. When do you want to finalize everything? David will prepare the amendment documents and payment agreement. We can sign everything next week. After hanging up, I felt a mixture of triumph and anticlimax. I'd won, but the victory felt hollow somehow. For 32 years I'd tried to maintain peace with Robert's family, and now I'd essentially declared war on them. It was necessary, but it wasn't satisfying in the way I'd expected. David called that afternoon to confirm that Patricia had contacted him directly to arrange the document signing. She sounded resigned but not happy. He reported, I think she finally understands that you're not someone she can manipulate. What's our next step? I'll draft the trust amendment and payment agreement. We'll schedule a signing meeting for early next week. After that, you'll start receiving regular trust distributions, and they'll start making debt payments, and if they default on the payments, then we have immediate grounds for formal collection action. But honestly, Dora, I think they'll stick to the agreement. The alternative is too expensive for them. That weekend I did something I hadn't done since Robert's diagnosis. I went shopping for myself, not groceries or necessities, but actual shopping for things I want. I bought new clothes, a comfortable reading chair, and some plants for my living room. Small things, but they represented something larger. I was planning for a future again. The signing meeting was scheduled for Tuesday morning at David's office. I arrived early, feeling nervous despite my apparent victory. Patricia and Marcus showed up exactly on time, both looking like they were attending their own execution. David had prepared comprehensive documents, a trust amendment that gave me equal input on all major decisions, quarterly reporting requirements, and specific criteria for distribution approval. The debt payment agreement established a monthly payment of $600 for 7 years, with penalties for late payments and acceleration clauses if they defaulted. Before we sign anything, Patricia said, I want to make sure we understand exactly what these changes mean. David walked through each document carefully, explaining the terms and implications. Patricia asked several questions, most of them focused on what would happen if they couldn't make payments or disagreed with trust decisions. The payment agreement is straightforward, David explained. $600 on the first of each month, automatically deducted from your bank account. If you miss a payment, there's a 10-day grace period. Then penalties kick in. If you miss 3 payments, the entire balance becomes due immediately, and the trust modification. Dora becomes an equal partner in all decisions about distributions above the basic monthly income. You'll still handle the administrative work, but you can't make unilateral decisions about her financial welfare. Marcus had been quiet through most of the meeting, but he finally spoke up. What if we disagree about a distribution request? Who makes the final decision? If you can't reach consensus, either party can request mediation. If mediation fails, the matter goes to the probate court for resolution. That could be expensive, Patricia observed. Yes, it could, David agreed, which is why I'd recommend good faith collaboration, rather than unnecessary conflicts. The message was clear. Fighting with me would cost them more money. They didn't. It was better for everyone if we could work together professionally, even if we'd never be friends again. We spent another hour reviewing details and signing documents. When it was finished, I had legal protections I hadn't possessed before, and Patricia and Marcus had financial obligations they couldn't escape. As we prepared to leave, Patricia made one last attempt at reconciliation. Dora, I hope you understand that we never meant to hurt you. The trust arrangements really were intended to help. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd spent 32 years treating me like an outsider, who'd manipulated my dying husband, who'd tried to steal my financial security while pretending to protect me. Patricia, if you'd wanted to help me, you would have asked me what I needed instead of deciding for me. You would have included me in discussions about my own future. You would have treated me like a competent adult instead of a child who needed supervision. You thought you could take advantage of my grief to position yourself as the responsible family member who deserved to control Robert's legacy. You thought I was too weak and too stupid to figure out what you were doing. You were wrong on both counts. She flinched like I'd slapped her. Marcus put his hand on her arm, probably warning her not to make things worse. I hope we can move forward more positively, she said stiffly. We can move forward professionally, I replied, but don't mistake professional cooperation for personal forgiveness. You've shown me exactly who you are, and I won't forget that. They left without another word, and David and I sat in his office, reviewing what we'd accomplished. How do you feel? He asked. Relieved mostly, and tired. I never wanted to be the kind of person who has to fight her own family. You're not fighting your family, Dora. You're protecting yourself from people who were trying to exploit you. There's a difference. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where Robert was buried. His grave was still covered with flowers from the funeral, though they were beginning to wilt in the summer heat. I sat on the small bench nearby and told him about everything that had happened since his death. I hope you'd be proud of me, I said to his headstone. I know you loved your family, but I couldn't let them steal the future you worked so hard to provide for me. The cemetery was quiet except for the sound of lawnmowers in the distance. I sat there for almost an hour, not crying, just thinking about the life Robert and I had built together and the life I was going to build alone. For the first time since his diagnosis, I felt hopeful about my future. I had financial security, legal protections, and most importantly, I'd rediscovered my own strength. Patricia had tried to reduce me to a helpless victim, but I'd fought back and won. The next few weeks settled into a new routine. The first trust distribution arrived in my bank account exactly when David had said it would. $3,000 that would cover my basic living expenses and give me some breathing room for small luxury. Patricia had processed the payment without complaint, though she'd included no personal note or communication. The first debt payment also arrived on schedule, $600, transferred electronically from Marcus's business account. It felt strange to be receiving money from people who'd treated me so badly for so long, but it also felt like justice. I used some of the trust money to take a trip to visit my sister Linda in Florida. It was the first vacation I'd taken in years, and definitely the first one I'd taken alone. Linda met me at the airport with a huge smile and a bottle of champagne. "I'm so proud of you," she said as we drove to her house. "When you first told me what Patricia was trying to pull, I was afraid you'd just let her get away with it." "I was tempted to," I admit. "Confrontation has never been my strong suit." "Well, you certainly found your voice." "Patricia must have been shocked when you started fighting back." "I think she was. She's used to me being the quiet, accommodating daughter-in-law who never makes waves." Linda laughed. "That woman died with Robert. The woman who fought Patricia is someone much stronger." We spent a week together, talking, shopping, and just enjoying each other's company. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again, not just Robert's widow or Patricia's victim, but Dora Jenkins, a woman with her own interests and plans. While I was in Florida, I received a call from Michelle, Robert's youngest sister. She'd heard about the trust situation from some mutual friends and wanted to know if the rumors were true. "Is it really true that Patricia tried to control your trust fund, and you had to threaten legal action to stop her?" "It's true," I confirmed. "She convinced Robert to sign documents giving her control over the trust while he was sick and medicated. I had to fight to get fair treatment." "That is so typical of Patricia. She's always thought she was smarter than everyone else and knew what was best for the family." "Well, she learned that I'm not as helpless as she assumed." "Good for you." "Robert would be proud. He never liked how his family treated you, but he was always trying to keep the peace." "I know, but keeping the peace isn't worth sacrificing my financial security." Michelle hesitated before asking her next question. "Dora, is it true that you're making them pay back money they borrowed from Robert?" "They borrowed almost $40,000 over the years, and never paid any of it back. Now they're paying it back with interest." "Wow, I had no idea they'd borrowed that much." "Robert was generous. Sometimes too generous, but I'm not Robert. And I can't afford to be a bank for people who treat me badly." When I returned from Florida, I found a message from Patricia on my answering machine. Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the strain underneath. "Dora, I need to discuss a trust distribution request with you. It's not urgent, but we should talk this week." I called her back the next morning. "What kind of distribution are you requesting?" "Well, it's not exactly a request. The trust has some investment gains that need to be distributed to avoid tax penalties. It's about $1,500. "That sounds routine. What's the issue?" "I wanted to make sure you approved before I processed it." I realized what was happening. Under the old trust arrangement, Patricia would have handled this automatically without consulting me. Now she was required to get my input on anything above routine monthly payments, and she was still adjusting to the new reality. $1,500 in investment gains. Sounds reasonable, I said. "Go ahead and process the distribution. Should I send it to your regular account?" "Yes. That's fine." There was a pause and I could tell she wanted to say something else. "Dora, I want you to know that I'm trying to work with you on this. I know we got off to a bad start, but I hope we can find a way to cooperate going forward." "Patricia, cooperation works both ways. You include me in decisions that affect my financial welfare, and I'll work with you professionally, but don't expect me to forget what you tried to do." "I understand." After hanging up, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. The satisfaction came from being treated as an equal partner in my own financial affairs. The sadness came from realizing that my relationship with Robert's family was probably irreparably damaged. But as I thought about it more, I realized that relationship had been damaged long before Robert's death. His family had never really accepted me, had never treated me as anything more than a temporary inconvenience in their brother's life. I'd spent 32 years trying to win their approval, compromising my own dignity in pursuit of an acceptance that was never really available. Robert's death had simply forced the underlying tensions into the open. Patricia's attempt to control me had been the logical extension of 3 decades of condescension and manipulation. If I hadn't fought back, she would have spent the rest of my life treating me like a dependent child who needed her supervision. That evening, I called David to update him on the trust distribution and Patricia's apparent willingness to cooperate. "That's encouraging," he said. "How are you feeling about everything now that the dust has settled?" "Stronger than I expected, and more independent than I've felt in years." "Any regrets about how you handled things?" I thought about it carefully before answering. "No regrets about protecting myself, maybe some sadness about how it had to happen, but no regrets about the outcome." "That sounds healthy. You did what you had to do to protect your interests, and you did it legally and ethically. Patricia created this situation by trying to manipulate you, not by your response to her manipulation." The next few months passed quietly. Patricia and I developed a professional working relationship around the trust management. She sent me quarterly reports and consulted me on any unusual decisions, but we had minimal personal contact. Marcus continued making his debt payments on schedule, though I knew from Linda's social media surveillance that they'd significantly scaled back their lifestyle. The boat was the first thing to go. Marcus listed it for sale in August and sold it by September, probably to help cover the debt payments. Their restaurant visits became less frequent, and Patricia's shopping posts disappeared almost entirely from her social media. I felt no sympathy for their financial adjustment. They were finally living within their means and paying their debts, something most responsible adults learn to do much earlier in life. If it meant fewer luxuries and more careful budgeting, well, that was the natural consequence of their poor financial decision. In October, I received an unexpected call from Marcus. His voice was nervous, and I could hear Patricia arguing with him in the background. "Dora, I need to talk to you about the payment schedule. We're having some cash flow issues, and I was wondering if we could adjust the monthly amount temporarily." "What kind of cash flow issues?" "My business has been slow, and we had some unexpected expenses. Could we reduce the payments to $400 a month for the next few months?" I could hear Patricia hissing at him to hang up, probably realizing that asking for payment reductions made them look financially irresponsible. "Marcus, the payment agreement we signed doesn't include provisions for temporary reduction. If you're having cash flow problems, maybe you need to look at your spending priority." "We've already cut back on everything we can. Have you?" Because Patricia was posting pictures of a shopping trip to Chicago just last week, there was silence on the line. He hadn't realized I was monitoring their social media, or that I'd see evidence contradicting their claims of financial hardship. "That was a birthday trip," he said weakly. "Patricia's sister paid for it. Marcus, you committed to a payment schedule, and I'm depending on that income. If you can afford birthday trips to Chicago, you can afford your debt payments. But what if we genuinely can't make a payment one month? Then the late fees kick in, and if you miss 3 payments, the entire balance becomes due immediately. Those are the terms you agreed to." I hung up feeling annoyed, but not surprised. Patricia and Marcus were testing boundaries, seeing if my resolve had weakened over time. They wanted to reduce their obligations without reducing their lifestyle, to have their cake and eat it too. I called David to report the conversation and ask about our options if they actually defaulted. "If they miss payments, we have immediate grounds for collection action," he confirmed. "But I suspect they're just testing you to see if you'll accept reduced payment. When they realize you won't, they'll find a way to meet their obligations. And if they don't, then we accelerate the debt and pursue formal collection. Garnish wages, place liens on property, whatever it takes to collect what they owe. Sure enough, the November payment arrived on schedule, and Marcus didn't call again about payment reductions. Patricia's social media posts about shopping and entertainment stopped entirely, and I got the impression they'd finally accepted the reality of their situation. In December, almost a year after Robert's death, I received a Christmas card from Patricia. It was a generic holiday card with no personal message. Just, Patricia and Marcus signed at the bottom. I interpreted it as a peace offering of sorts, an acknowledgement that we could coexist professionally, even if we'd never be friends again. I sent a card back, equally generic, equally impersonal. It felt like the appropriate level of interaction, polite but distant, professional but not personal. On the first anniversary of Robert's death, I visited his grave again. The headstone looked settled now, no longer new and raw. I brought fresh flowers and sat on the bench, thinking about everything that had changed in the past year. I kept the house, I told him, and I kept my dignity. Patricia learned that I'm not someone she can push around, and I learned that I'm stronger than I thought I was. The cemetery was peaceful in the winter afternoon. Snow was beginning to fall, dusting the headstones and making everything look clean and new. I miss you every day, I continued, but I'm not just surviving anymore, I'm actually living again. I think you'd be proud of that. Driving home through the snow, I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago and the woman I was now. The old Dora had been defined by her relationships. Robert's wife, Patricia's sister-in-law, the accommodating family member who never made waves. The new Dora was defined by her own choices and actions. She was a woman who could research legal documents, negotiate with lawyers, and stand up to people who tried to manipulate her. She was someone who could live alone without being lonely, who could make decisions without seeking approval, who could defend herself without apology. Patricia had thought grief would make me weak and compliant. Instead, it had burned away everything unnecessary and revealed the core of strength I'd always possessed, but never needed to use. I'd survived Robert's death, Patricia's betrayal, and my own fears about living independently. I'd fought for my rights and won. I'd learned to value myself enough to demand fair treatment. Most importantly, I'd learned that being alone didn't mean being helpless, and that sometimes the people who claim to be protecting you are the ones you most need protection from. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: excitement about the future. Not just acceptance or resignation, but actual anticipation for what came next. I was 62 years old, financially secure, and finally free to make my own choices without worrying about keeping peace with people who didn't respect me. For the first time in my adult life, I belonged entirely to myself. It had taken a war with my husband's family to teach me that lesson, but some lessons are worth whatever they cost to learn. Patricia had intended to control and diminish me. Instead, she'd freed me from 32 years of trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give. I unlocked my front door and stepped into my warm, quiet house. Tomorrow I would start planning the next chapter of my life, but tonight I would simply enjoy the peace that comes from knowing you've fought for yourself and won. The woman who'd discovered her husband's family planning his funeral without her was gone. In her place was someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more free. Patricia had given me an unexpected gift. She'd taught me that I didn't need anyone's permission to protect myself or demand respect. That lesson was worth every moment of conflict, every dollar of legal fees, every bridge I'd had to burn. I was alone, but I was not helpless. I was grieving, but I was not defeated. I was older, but I was not weak. I was exactly who I needed to be. Spring came early that year, and with it, the first real test of the agreements Patricia and I had signed. I was sitting in my garden, enjoying the warmth of the April sun, when my phone rang. It was David Morrison, and his tone was serious. "Dora, we have a problem. Patricia's attorney called this morning. They're claiming financial hardship and requesting a formal modification of both the debt payment and trust arrangements." I set down my coffee cup, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest that meant trouble was coming. "What kind of modification?" "They want to reduce the debt payments to $300 a month and extend the term to 10 years. They're also requesting that you waive your oversight rights on trust distributions, claiming the quarterly consultations are creating unnecessary delays and expenses. I felt my blood pressure rising. After months of relatively peaceful coexistence, Patricia was making another grab for control, using Marcus's business problems as justification for breaking the agreements we'd negotiated. What's their justification for these requests? Marcus's insurance agency lost its largest client last month. According to their attorney, it's reduced their monthly income by about 40%. Did they mention why the client left? No, but I did some checking. The client filed a complaint with the State Insurance Commission about delayed claims processing and poor customer service. Marcus's financial troubles appear to be affecting his work quality. I wasn't surprised. When someone is struggling to pay their personal bills, it's hard to focus on professional responsibilities. Marcus had probably been distracted and overwhelmed, leading to the kind of service problems that drive clients away. What happens if we refuse their modification request? They can petition the court for relief, but given their track record and the circumstances of the original agreements, I doubt a judge would be sympathetic. More likely, they're hoping you'll agree to avoid legal expenses, and if I don't agree and they default on payment, then we accelerate the debt and pursue collection. But Dora, there's something else you should know. My contact at the courthouse says Patricia and Marcus filed for bankruptcy protection last week. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Bankruptcy would potentially wipe out the debt they owed me, and could complicate the trust arrangements. Patricia was making a desperate play to escape her obligations entirely. What does that mean for me? It depends on the type of bankruptcy and how the court classifies the debt. If they filed Chapter 7, they could potentially discharge the debt entirely. If it's Chapter 13, they'd have to include the debt in their reorganization plan, but the payments might be reduced significantly. Can they do that? Just walk away from agreements they signed less than a year ago? Bankruptcy law is complicated, but the short answer is maybe. However, there are several factors working in your favor. The debt is well documented. It predates their current financial troubles, and they've been making payments under the agreement, which shows they acknowledged its validity. I was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Patricia had spent months making payments and appearing to cooperate, but apparently she'd been planning this escape route all along. She'd played the long game, waiting until she could claim genuine financial hardship before trying to break free of her obligation. What's our next step? I need to file a claim in their bankruptcy case to protect your interest. We'll argue that the debt should be classified as non-dischargeable because it was obtained through fraud or misrepresentation. We'll also need to address how the bankruptcy affects the trust arrangements. How long will this take? Bankruptcy proceedings can take months or even years. But don't worry, Dora. We have strong documentation and good arguments. Patricia may think bankruptcy will solve all her problems, but she's about to discover it's not that simple. After hanging up with David, I sat in my garden feeling a familiar mixture of anger and determination. I'd thought the worst was behind me, that Patricia had finally accepted the new reality of our relationship. Instead, she'd been planning another betrayal, another attempt to escape the consequences of her action. But this time, I wasn't the grief-stricken widow she'd originally tried to manipulate. I was a woman who'd already fought one legal battle and won. If Patricia wanted to escalate things to bankruptcy court, I was ready for that fight too. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal meetings, document preparation, and strategy sessions. David introduced me to Sarah Chen, a bankruptcy attorney who specialized in creditor rights. Sarah was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 40s who immediately understood the situation. This is a classic bad faith bankruptcy filing, she explained during our first meeting. They're using the bankruptcy system to escape debts they could otherwise pay, while maintaining their lifestyle and assets. Can they get away with it? Not if we do our job properly. Bankruptcy courts don't look kindly on debtors who file for protection while continuing to live beyond their means. If we can show that Patricia and Marcus are hiding assets or living extravagantly while claiming poverty, the court will be very unsympathetic. Sarah had already begun investigating their financial situation, and what she'd found was illuminating. Despite claiming financial hardship, Patricia and Marcus had somehow managed to keep their expensive cars, their country club membership, and their vacation home in Michigan. How is that possible if they're truly struggling financially? It's possible because they've been very clever about how they structure their assets, Sarah explained. The vacation home is titled in Patricia's mother's name, though they pay the expenses and use it exclusive. The country club membership is through Marcus's business, so it's technically a business expense. The cars are leased rather than owned, so they don't show up as assets in the bankruptcy filing. That sounds like fraud. It's certainly aggressive asset protection, and it may cross the line into fraud. If we can prove they deliberately moved assets around to hide them from creditors, the bankruptcy court can dismiss their case entirely. I spent the next month working with Sarah to gather evidence of Patricia and Marcus's true financial situation. We subpoenaed their bank records, credit card statements, and business accounts. We examined their social media posts for evidence of undisclosed income or assets. We interviewed former clients of Marcus's insurance agency to document the service problems that had led to lost business. What emerged was a picture of two people who'd continued living an upper-middle-class lifestyle while claiming poverty in their bankruptcy filing. They'd spent thousands of dollars on home improvements in the months before filing for bankruptcy. They'd taken a vacation to Europe, carefully timing it so the expenses wouldn't appear in the required financial disclosure. They'd even bought new furniture and electronics, apparently rushing to spend money before the bankruptcy court could freeze their assets. Most damaging was evidence that Marcus had been diverting business income to personal accounts to hide it from creditors. His insurance agency showed minimal profits on paper, but we found evidence of cash payments from clients that were never reported as business income. This is textbook bankruptcy fraud, Sarah told me after reviewing all the evidence. They've been systematically hiding assets and income while claiming they can't pay their debts. What happens now? Now we file a motion to dismiss their bankruptcy case for bad faith and fraudulent conduct. If the court agrees, their bankruptcy protection disappears, and you can pursue full collection of the debt with penalties and interest. The bankruptcy hearing was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday morning in May. I arrived at the courthouse with David and Sarah, feeling nervous but prepared. Patricia and Marcus were already there with their attorney, a tired-looking man who seemed uncomfortable with his client's case. The bankruptcy judge was a stern woman in her 60s who'd clearly seen every trick desperate debtors could devise. She reviewed our motion to dismiss with obvious interest, particularly the evidence of hidden assets and fraudulent transfers. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that his clients were victims of circumstance, that Marcus's business problems were genuine, and their lifestyle reductions were evidence of good faith efforts to address their debts. Sarah's response was devastating. She methodically presented evidence of hidden income, concealed assets, and deliberate attempts to defraud creditors. She showed the court social media posts of expensive purchases made weeks before the bankruptcy filing. She presented testimony from Marcus's former clients about service problems that suggested deliberate neglect of his business responsibilities. The judge listened without comment until Sarah finished her presentation. Then she turned to Patricia's attorney with an expression that could have frozen water. "Counselor, your clients appear to have treated the bankruptcy system as a convenience store for debt elimination, rather than the fresh start mechanism it's intended to be. They've hidden assets, concealed income, and continued living beyond their means while claiming poverty. Do you have any explanation for this conduct?" Patricia's attorney stammered through a weak response about good faith efforts and misunderstandings, but it was clear the judge wasn't buying. "I'm going to grant the motion to dismiss," the judge announced. "This bankruptcy case is dismissed with prejudice for bad faith conduct and fraudulent asset concealment. The automatic stay is lifted immediately, and creditors are free to pursue collection activities." Patricia's face went white. Marcus looked like he might faint. Their attorney gathered his papers quickly, probably eager to distance himself from clients who'd lied to him about their financial situation. As we left the courthouse, I felt a surge of vindication. Patricia had tried to use the bankruptcy system to escape the consequences of her actions, and the court had seen right through her scheme. Now she was in a worse position than before, facing potential criminal charges for bankruptcy fraud in addition to the original debt. David and Sarah were both pleased with the outcome. "This is one of the cleanest dismissals I've seen," Sarah told me. "The judge was clearly outraged by their conduct. You now have every legal remedy available to collect your debt, plus additional penalties for their fraudulent behavior. What's our next step? We file new collection actions immediately, David explained. Wage garnishment, asset seizure, liens on their property. We also refer the bankruptcy fraud evidence to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution. Could they actually face criminal charges? Bankruptcy fraud is a federal felony, Sarah confirmed. Given the evidence we've compiled, prosecution is definitely possible. At minimum, the threat of criminal charges will make them much more cooperative about paying the debt. That afternoon, David filed collection actions against both Patricia and Marcus. We placed liens on their house and cars, garnished Marcus's business income, and froze their bank account. Within hours, they went from thinking they'd escaped their debts to finding themselves unable to access their own money. Patricia called me that evening, her voice shaking with rage and desperation. Dora, what you're doing is cruel and vindictive. We're family, and you're destroying us over money. Patricia, you tried to steal my financial future, manipulated my dying husband, and then attempted to defraud the bankruptcy court to escape paying your debts. If anyone destroyed this family, it was you. We were just trying to get back on our feet financially. By hiding assets and lying to a federal judge, that's not getting back on your feet, Patricia. That's criminal fraud. What do you want from us? We don't have the money you're demanding. Actually, you do have the money. You just spent it on vacations and luxury purchases instead of paying your debts. Now you're going to learn what happens when you lie to bankruptcy courts. Are you really going to let us lose everything over this? Patricia, you made these choices. You borrowed money and didn't pay it back. You manipulated Robert's trust arrangements. You tried to control my financial future. You lied to bankruptcy courts. Every consequence you're facing is the direct result of your own actions. Please, Dora, can't we work something out? We had a payment agreement. You violated. We had trust arrangements. You tried to escape them through fraud. The time for working things out is over. I hung up and immediately called David to report the conversation. She's panicking, he observed. The reality of their situation is finally sinking. I expect we'll hear from their attorney soon with a settlement offer. Sure enough, the next morning Patricia's attorney called David with a proposal. They wanted to settle the debt for $30,000, paid immediately, in exchange for releasing all collection actions and agreeing not to pursue criminal charges. What do you think? David asked me. What's the full amount they owe now, including penalties and interest? With the bankruptcy dismissal penalties and collection costs, it's about $65,000. And how likely are we to collect the full amount, given their assets and income? Probably very likely. The garnishments and liens will force payment even if they don't cooperate voluntarily. Then no deal. They tried to cheat me through bankruptcy fraud, and now they want a discount for getting caught. Let the collection process run its course. David called Patricia's attorney back and rejected the settlement offer. Within an hour we received a new proposal, $45,000, paid over 6 months, with personal guarantees, from both Patricia and Marcus. I rejected that offer too. Patricia had spent months plotting to escape her obligations, lying to courts and creditors, hiding assets and income. Now that her scheme had collapsed, she wanted mercy she'd never shown me. By the end of the week, Patricia and Marcus were feeling the full impact of the collection action. Marcus's business bank account was frozen, making it impossible for him to operate his insurance agency. Their personal accounts were garnished, leaving them with minimal access to cash. The liens on their property meant they couldn't sell or refinance without paying off the debt first. Patricia called me again on Friday, this time sounding completely defeated. Dora, you've won. We can't function with all these collection actions in place. What will it take to make this stop? Full payment of the debt, including all penalties and collection costs, $65,000. We don't have that much money available. Then sell something. You have a vacation home, expensive cars, country club membership. You've been living beyond your means for years. It's time to downsize to a lifestyle you can actually afford. The vacation home isn't even in our name. Patricia, don't lie to me. I know about the shell game you've been playing with assets. The bankruptcy court saw right through it, and so do I. You can either pay the debt voluntarily, or have your assets seized and sold at auction. Your choice. How long do we have? The collection actions continue until the debt is paid in full. Every day you delay, the interest and penalties keep accumulating. That weekend, Patricia and Marcus put their vacation home on the market. They also listed Marcus's boat and Patricia's luxury car for sale. It was a fire sale with prices below market value because they needed cash quickly. By Monday they'd managed to raise $40,000 from asset sales and liquidating investment. They called David with a proposal to pay the full $65,000 in 2 installments, $40,000 immediately, and $25,000 within 60 days. What do you think? David asked me. Do we have guarantees that the second payment will be made? They're offering to put the deed to their house in escrow as security. If they don't make the second payment, you get the house. Their house was worth about $200,000, so it was more than adequate security for the remaining debt. I agreed to the payment plan, and David drafted the settlement agreement. The first payment arrived within 2 days, along with the signed escrow documents for their house. Patricia and Marcus had finally accepted that I wasn't going to be the passive victim they'd expected me to be, but the 60-day deadline for the second payment created a new source of tension. As the deadline approached, it became clear that Patricia and Marcus were struggling to raise the remaining $25,000. They'd already sold their most liquid assets, and their reduced income made it difficult to accumulate cash quickly. 2 weeks before the deadline, Patricia called me with another proposal. Dora, we're having trouble raising the full $25,000 by the deadline. Could we pay $15,000 now and the remaining $10,000 over the next 6 months? Patricia, we have a signed agreement. You have 2 weeks to make the payment, or the house goes into foreclosure. But that's not fair. We've been trying to cooperate, and we've already paid most of the debt. You've been trying to cooperate after attempting bankruptcy fraud to escape paying anything at all. The agreement we signed is the agreement you'll honor. What if we just can't come up with the money? Then you'll lose your house. It's that simple. You would really take our home over $10,000 or $15,000. Patricia, this isn't about $10,000 or $15,000. This is about the fact that you've spent 2 years trying to cheat me out of money that rightfully belongs to me. You manipulated my dying husband, tried to steal my trust fund, and committed bankruptcy fraud to escape your debts. Every consequence you're facing is the result of your own choices. But we're family. Family doesn't treat each other the way you've treated me. Family doesn't manipulate dying relatives or steal from widows. You forfeited any claim to family consideration when you decided to betray my trust. The second payment arrived on the last possible day, cobbled together from borrowed money and the sale of Patricia's jewelry collection. When David confirmed that the full debt had been paid, I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It had taken almost 2 years, but I'd finally collected every penny they owed me, plus penalties and interest for their fraudulent behavior. More importantly, I'd proven to myself and to them that I wasn't someone who could be manipulated or cheated. The final settlement included provisions that made it clear our business relationship was permanently concluded. Patricia was removed as trustee of Robert's Trust, replaced by a professional trust company that would manage distributions according to clear, objective criteria. All outstanding promissory notes were marked as satisfied. Most importantly, there was a clause stating that Patricia and Marcus waived any claims to Robert's estate or trust fund in perpetuity. That evening, I called Michelle to update her on the final resolution. I can't believe they actually tried bankruptcy fraud, she said. Patricia always thought she was smarter than everyone else. But that was just stupid. Desperate people make stupid decisions. They'd backed themselves into a corner and thought bankruptcy would be an easy escape. How do you feel now that it's all over? Tired mostly. And maybe a little sad that it had to end this way. But I'm not sorry I fought back. If I hadn't stood up to them, they would have spent the rest of my life controlling and manipulating me. Robert would be proud of you. I hope so. I sometimes wonder if he'd want me to forgive and forget. Try to rebuild the family relationships. Dora, Robert loved you, but he also knew how his family treated you. He wouldn't want you to let them walk all over you just to keep the peace. After hanging up, I sat in my living room thinking about everything that had happened since Robert's death. I'd started as a grieving widow being manipulated by people I'd trusted for 30 years. I'd ended as a woman who'd successfully fought multiple legal battles to protect her rights and interests. Patricia had taught me an important lesson. People will treat you exactly as badly as you allow them to treat you. For decades, I'd accepted condescension and manipulation from Robert's family because I thought keeping the peace was more important than standing up for myself. Robert's death had forced me to choose between continuing to be a victim or learning to fight back. I'd chosen to fight, and while it hadn't been easy or pleasant, it had been necessary. The next morning I met with Jennifer Walsh, the professional trustee who was taking over management of Robert's trust. She was a certified public accountant with 20 years of experience in trust administration, and her approach was refreshingly straightforward. My job is to manage the trust assets prudently and make distributions according to the trust terms, she explained. I don't make subjective judgments about your spending or lifestyle choices. As long as the distributions are consistent with the trust's purposes, you'll receive them without interference. What about quarterly reports and consultation requirements? I'll provide quarterly reports as a matter of course, but they're for your information, not for approval. You're the beneficiary, not a child who needs supervision. It was a stark contrast to Patricia's approach, which had been based on the assumption that I needed guidance and oversight. Jennifer treated me like a competent adult who could manage her own affairs, which was exactly what I'd been fighting for all along. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery to visit Robert's grave. Spring was in full bloom, and the cemetery looked peaceful and well-maintained. I brought fresh flowers and sat on the bench where I'd spent so many hours over the past 2 years. It's finally over, I told him. Patricia and Marcus paid back everything they owed you, with interest. The trust is being managed by professionals who actually respect. I'm financially secure and legally protected. A gentle breeze stirred the trees around his grave, and I imagined it was his way of acknowledging what I'd accomplished. I'm not the same person I was when you died, I continued. I'm stronger now, more independent. I learned to fight for myself instead of just accepting whatever other people decided was best for me. I sat there for almost an hour, enjoying the peaceful afternoon and reflecting on how much my life had changed. 2 years ago, I'd been a dependent wife who let other people make decisions for her. Now I was a woman who could research legal documents, hire attorneys, and stand up to people who tried to manipulate her. The transformation hadn't been easy or pleasant, but it had been necessary. Patricia's betrayal had forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, to develop skills I'd never needed before, to become someone I'd never imagined I could be. As I prepared to leave the cemetery, I felt grateful for the hard-won lessons of the past 2 years. I'd learned that being alone didn't mean being helpless, that grief could make you stronger instead of weaker, and that sometimes the people who claim to be protecting you are the ones you most need protection from. Most importantly, I'd learned that I was capable of protecting myself, of fighting for my rights, of demanding respect from people who preferred to give condescension. Patricia had intended to control and diminish me. Instead, she'd freed me from 30 years of accepting treatment I didn't deserve. She'd given me the greatest gift of all, the knowledge that I didn't need anyone's permission to stand up for myself. Driving home through the spring afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Robert's diagnosis: excitement about the future. Not just acceptance or resignation, but genuine anticipation for what came next. I was 64 years old, financially secure, legally protected, and finally free to make my own choices without worrying about anyone else's approval. For the first time in my adult life, I belonged entirely to myself. It had taken a war with my husband's family to teach me that lesson, but some lessons are worth whatever they cost to learn. The woman who discovered her husband's family planning his funeral without her was gone forever. In her place was someone who would never again let anyone treat her as less than she was worth. And that woman was just getting started. 3 months after the final settlement with Patricia and Marcus, I was sitting in my newly renovated kitchen when the phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was familiar. "Mrs. Jenkins, this is Detective Ray Coleman from the Montgomery County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about the bankruptcy fraud case involving Patricia and Marcus Jenkins. The U.S. Attorney's Office has decided to pursue criminal charges, and we'd like to schedule a time to interview you as a witness. I set down my morning coffee, feeling a mix of satisfaction and apprehension. While I'd moved on with my life, the legal system was still working its way through the consequences of Patricia and Marcus's fraudulent behavior. What kind of charges are they facing? Multiple counts of bankruptcy fraud, concealment of assets, and making false statements under oath. If convicted, they could face significant prison time and substantial fines. The interview was scheduled for the following week at the federal building downtown. Detective Coleman was a professional, methodical man who walked me through the evidence systematically. We reviewed Patricia and Marcus's hidden assets, their false statements to the bankruptcy court, and their attempts to shield property from creditors. Your documentation was crucial to building this case, he told me. Most fraud victims don't have the kind of comprehensive evidence you provide. It made the prosecutor's job much easier. What happens next? The grand jury will review the evidence and likely issue indictments within the next month. After that, it depends on whether they want to fight the charges or negotiate a plea agreement. Driving home from the interview, I reflected on how far I'd come since Robert's death. 2.5 years ago, I'd been a grieving widow being manipulated by people I'd trusted. Now I was a federal witness in a criminal fraud case, having successfully exposed and defeated people who'd tried to steal my financial security. The transformation still amazed me sometimes. The old Dora would never have had the knowledge, skills, or determination to fight a multi-year legal battle against experienced manipulators. She would have accepted whatever treatment she received and probably thanked them for their help. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. The change hadn't been easy or pleasant, but it had been absolutely necessary. That evening, I called Michelle to update her on the criminal case development. "I can't believe it's come to this," she said. "When you first told me about Patricia's scheme with the trust fund, I thought it was just typical family greediness. I never imagined she'd end up facing federal charges." Neither did I, honestly. But when people choose to commit crimes, they have to face the consequences. "How do you feel about them potentially going to prison?" I thought about her question carefully before answering. "I don't take any pleasure in their suffering, but I'm not sorry they're being held accountable. They didn't just steal from me, Michelle. They committed fraud against the federal court system. That has consequences beyond our family dispute. Do you think Robert would approve of how you've handled everything?" "I think Robert would be proud that I learned to stand up for myself. He spent 30 years trying to shield me from his family's worst behavior. But he's not here to do that anymore. I had to learn to protect myself." 2 weeks later, the federal grand jury issued indictments against both Patricia and Marcus. The charges were extensive: bankruptcy fraud, concealment of assets, perjury, and conspiracy to defraud creditors. The local newspaper ran a story about the case, describing it as one of the most blatant examples of bankruptcy fraud the district had seen in years. I received calls from several reporters wanting to interview me about the case, but I declined all requests. This wasn't about public vindication or revenge. It was about justice running its course through the proper legal channel. Patricia's attorney called David a few days after the indictments were announced. They wanted to know if I would be willing to provide a victim impact statement supporting leniency in exchange for full restitution and a guilty plea. "What kind of restitution are they offering?" I asked David. "Full repayment of all legal fees and costs you incurred fighting their fraud, plus an additional penalty payment of $25,000. "And what would I have to do?" "Write a letter to the court saying you've been made whole financially, and don't object to a lenient sentence." I considered the offer carefully. The legal fees and costs had been substantial, probably close to $40,000 over the course of all the litigation. Getting that money back would be meaningful, and the additional penalty would send a clear message about the cost of trying to defraud me. "Tell them I'll consider it if they agree to a guilty plea on all charges, and a formal apology acknowledging what they did wrong." David called back the next day with their response. Patricia and Marcus would plead guilty to all fraud charges, pay full restitution plus the penalty, and provide written apologies acknowledging their criminal behavior. In exchange, I would support a sentence of probation rather than prison time. "What do you think?" David asked. "I think it's fair. They'll have felony convictions on their records, They'll pay substantial financial penalties, and they'll be on federal probation for years. That seems proportionate to what they did. The plea hearing was scheduled for early fall. I didn't attend, choosing instead to let the legal process proceed without my presence. David represented my interests and confirmed that all the agreed-upon terms were included in the final plea agreement. Patricia and Marcus each received 3 years of federal probation, substantial fines, and permanent felony records. More importantly for me, they paid $68,000 in restitution and penalties, finally compensating me for the full cost of their fraudulent behavior. The written apologies arrived a week after the sentencing. Patricia's letter was brief and formal, acknowledging that she had made poor decisions and expressing regret for the misunderstandings that had occurred. It was a typical non-apology that took minimal responsibility while trying to minimize the severity of her actions. Marcus's letter was more forthright. He admitted that they had deliberately hidden assets and lied to the bankruptcy court, and he acknowledged that their treatment of me had been unfair and wrong. It wasn't a complete acceptance of responsibility, but it was better than Patricia's evasive language. I filed both letters away without responding. The legal proceedings were over, justice had been served, and I had no desire to continue any relationship with people who had proven themselves untrustworthy. By the time winter arrived, I had settled into a new routine that felt comfortable and sustainable. The trust fund provided steady income that covered my living expenses and allowed for occasional luxuries. The restitution payments had replenished my savings account. Most importantly, I had learned to live independently and make decisions based on my own preferences, rather than other people's expectations. I'd joined a book club at the local library, started volunteering at a literacy program, and even begun taking art classes at the community college. For the first time since Robert's death, I was building a social life based on my own interests, rather than family obligations. The house felt different too. I'd redecorated several rooms, replacing Robert's dark masculine furniture with brighter, more contemporary pieces that reflected my own taste. It was still the same house we'd shared for 20 years, but now it felt like my home rather than our home. One snowy evening in December, I was reading by the fireplace when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors were rare, since I'd stopped hosting family gatherings. Through the peephole I saw a young woman I didn't recognize holding a small package. "Mrs. Jenkins, I'm Sarah Marcus, Patricia Jenkins's daughter. I have something I'd like to give you." I opened the door cautiously. Sarah was in her early 20s, with Patricia's sharp features but a much kinder expression. I'd met her a few times at family gatherings over the years, but we'd never had significant conversations. "Hello, Sarah, what can I do for you?" "I wanted to give you this," she said, handing me a wrapped package, "and I wanted to apologize for my mother's behavior. I know what she did to you was wrong." I invited her in out of the cold and offered her coffee. She accepted gratefully, shaking snow from her coat as she settled into my living room. "Sarah, you don't need to apologize for your mother's actions. You weren't involved in any of this." "I know, but I felt like someone from the family should acknowledge what happened. My mother has been telling everyone that you were vindictive and greedy, that you destroyed the family over money, but I know that's not true. What do you know about what happened?" Sarah looked uncomfortable but determined to continue. "More than my mother realizes, I work for a law firm downtown, and I have access to court records. I read everything. The trust documents, the bankruptcy filings, the fraud evidence. I know exactly what my parents did to you." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Uncle Robert was always kind to me. He helped pay for my college tuition when my parents couldn't afford it. When I heard about the trust situation and the debt collection, I couldn't believe my mother would betray someone who had been so generous to our family." I unwrapped the package she'd brought. Inside was a small jewelry box containing a silver bracelet that had belonged to Robert's mother. It wasn't expensive, but it had sentimental value because Robert had worn it as a child before it was passed down through the family. "My mother sold most of grandmother's jewelry to pay the restitution," Sarah explained, "but I managed to save this piece because I knew Uncle Robert would want you to have it." I was touched by the gesture, not because of the bracelet's monetary value, but because Sarah had thought to preserve something meaningful from Robert's family heritage. "Thank you, Sarah. This means more to me than you know." "Mrs. Jenkins, I want you to know that not everyone in the family supported what my parents did. Some of us think you did exactly what you should have done. We talked for another hour about Robert, about family dynamics, and about Sarah's plans for the future. She was articulate, thoughtful, and clearly embarrassed by her parents' behavior. Before she left, she asked if she could stay in touch occasionally. I'd like that, I told her honestly. You remind me a lot of your uncle when he was young. After Sarah left, I sat by the fireplace holding the silver bracelet and thinking about family connection. Patricia and Marcus had severed their relationship with me through their own criminal behavior. But blood relationships were more complicated than legal disputes. Sarah represented the possibility that not all family connections had to be toxic or manipulative. The holidays passed quietly but pleasantly. I spent Christmas with Linda and her family in Florida, enjoying the warmth and the distance from Ohio's winter weather. It was the first holiday season since Robert's death that I didn't feel obligated to maintain relationships that brought me no joy. When I returned home in January, I found a letter from Jennifer Walsh, the professional trustee, informing me that the trust had performed well in the previous year, and recommending increased distributions to take advantage of favorable tax conditions. It was a stark contrast to Patricia's approach, which had been based on control and condescension rather than professional competence. Spring brought news that Marcus's insurance agency had finally closed permanently. Without the ability to maintain professional licenses after his fraud conviction, he'd been forced to liquidate the business and find employment with another agency. Patricia had taken a job as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, probably the first regular employment she'd had in years. I felt no satisfaction in their professional downfall. They had created their own problems through criminal behavior, and they were facing the natural consequences of those choices. But I also didn't feel any sympathy for their situation. They had made deliberate decisions to commit fraud, and the results were entirely predictable. That summer I took my first international trip since Robert's death. I'd always wanted to visit Ireland, and with my financial security assured, I finally had the freedom to pursue that dream. It was a solo trip, something the old Dora would never have considered, but the new version of myself found traveling alone liberating rather than lonely. The trip was transformative in ways I hadn't expected. For 10 days I was simply Dora Jenkins, American tourist, not Robert's widow or Patricia's victim or anyone's adversary. I was just a woman exploring a beautiful country, making decisions based entirely on my own preferences and schedule. I came home with hundreds of photos, a suitcase full of souvenirs and a renewed sense of possibility about the future. At 66 I was healthier, wealthier, and more independent than I'd ever been. The trauma of Robert's death and the family legal battles had been painful, but they had also taught me strengths I'd never known I possessed. That fall, I received an unexpected phone call from Detective Coleman. Mrs. Jenkins, I wanted to update you on Patricia and Marcus Jenkins. They've both completed their first year of federal probation without any violations. Their probation officer says they're complying with all requirements, and seem to have learned from their experience. I'm glad to hear they're staying out of trouble. I also wanted to thank you again for your cooperation with the prosecution. Cases like this send a strong message that bankruptcy fraud has serious consequences. After hanging up, I realized I felt genuinely pleased that Patricia and Marcus were successfully completing their probation. I hadn't wanted to see them destroyed, just held accountable for their actions. If they were learning to live within the law and their means, that was the best possible outcome for everyone involved. That evening I sat in my garden watching the sunset and reflecting on the 3-year journey from Robert's death to this moment of peace and stability. The woman who had discovered her husband's family planning his funeral without her was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. Patricia had thought grief would make me weak and manipulable. Instead, it had revealed reserves of strength I'd never needed to access before. The process of fighting for my rights had taught me skills I'd never imagined needing: legal research, financial investigation, strategic planning, and the ability to stand firm against people who preferred compliance to justice. Most importantly, I'd learned that being alone didn't mean being helpless. that independence was more valuable than keeping peace with people who didn't respect me, and that sometimes the people who claim to be protecting you are the ones you most need protection from. The legal battles were over, justice had been served, and I had emerged not just victorious but transformed. At an age when many people were slowing down, I was discovering new possibilities and freedoms I'd never experienced. I'd won more than money in my fight against Patricia and Marcus. I'd won back my self-respect, my independence, and my faith in my own judgment. Those victories were worth more than any financial settlement could ever be. As darkness fell over my garden, I felt grateful for the hard-won lessons of the past 3 years. They had cost me dearly in stress, legal fees and family relationships, but they had given me something invaluable in return: the knowledge that I was capable of protecting myself against anyone who tried to take advantage of me. The woman who would never again let anyone treat her as less than she was worth was finally at peace, financially secure, and excited about whatever challenges and opportunities the future might bring. And that woman was just getting started on the best years of her life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.